"I can't take that," the old man said, and he pushed the coffee cup back across the counter with 2 fingers, the gesture so careful it was almost ceremonial. "Not unless you're charging me for it, and I don't have what that cost today." His hands, when Rowena looked at them, were the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime making things. The knuckles were swollen, the fingers bent at odd angles from some old injury, or just old age, and there was dried grey clay packed under every nail like tide, settled in the crevices of rock. He was thin in a way that worried her, not thin from dieting or from vanity, but thin from forgetting, thin from a body that had stopped insisting on itself. "I wasn't charging you," Rowena Hess said. She wiped her hands on her apron. "I was clearing the counter and you were sitting there looking like the rain hadn't finished with you yet." The coffee was in the way. His pale eyes, the color of old window glass, gray and slightly watery, moved over her face with the slow, assessing quality of a man who had been lied to kindly before. "That's a generous accounting of it," he said. "Drink it before it goes cold and becomes a genuine waste. Then the accounting changes." He drank. Slowly, both hands wrapped around the mug, and Rowena, who had inherited the Hearthstone Bakery from her Aunt Lila 3 years before, along with its mortgage and its ancient oven and a regulars list that had thinned to almost nothing, since the highway bypass pulled the through traffic away from Carver's Mill, went back to folding napkins and told herself this was none of her business. She had told herself that before. She was not very good at believing it. What she could not have known, standing in her failing bakery on a Tuesday in November, with rain streaking the front glass and $58 in the register, was that the cup of coffee she had just pushed across the counter to a man she had never met would change the entire shape of her life. What she could not have known was that the old man with the clay under his nails was carrying the weight of a secret that had been locked for 37 years in a room she hadn't yet been inside, and that whatever was in that room had been waiting, the way old things wait, patiently, without any hurry for exactly this. But that came later. First there was the rain and the coffee, and a man too proud to accept either without negotiation. His name was Victor. He offered it when she set the soup in front of him. She had made it anyway, a pot of vegetable and barley she could truthfully have said was left from the morning, though it was not, and she did not let herself look too hard at the lie. And he offered only the first name, the way a person does when they are not ready to be fully known. "Rowena," she said, "this is my place." Victor looked around the hearthstone the way an architect reads a building. The exposed brick she'd kept because it was the only beautiful thing in the room that didn't cost extra. The shelf of mismatched cups her aunt had collected over 30 years. The single window table where the light came through in the afternoon and made everything look warmer than it was. "Your aunt's place," he said, and then caught himself, and a careful blankness moved across his face. "Sorry, I only meant the building is older than you are. You can tell." Rowena set down a spoon. "You've been through town before." Once or twice he looked at his soup, a long time ago. She let it go. She had her own long-time agos, and she had learned that people offered them when they were ready and not before. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the third day, Rowena had stopped pretending the soup was accidental, and he had stopped pretending he was going to offer payment, and something between them settled into a strange, comfortable truce. He sat at the counter and she worked, and sometimes he talked, and sometimes she talked, and sometimes neither of them did, which was the rarest kind of ease she had found in another person in a long while. He had been a ceramicist, not hobbyist ceramics, but the kind that ends up in galleries, the kind that takes 40 years and a particular violence of attention to get right. He didn't say it in those terms, he said it simply, the way people speak of former things, in the past tense and without flinching, which told her the tense was deliberate, was, not is. "What stopped you?" she asked once, refilling his cup. His hands were flat on the counter and he looked at them. The hands went. Arthritis, mostly. There's a point past which you can feel what the clay should be and can't make it that way, and that's the point that finishes most of us. He paused. "I finished a few years before the hands did. That's a worse thing. Knowing you stopped for reasons that weren't the hands." She didn't ask what the reasons were. She filed it away. On the 4th day he drew her. Not on paper, he didn't have any, but on the back of her own order pad, a quick fluid sketch in ballpoint pen, the lines moving with a quickness that changed his whole posture. His shoulders loosened, the lines around his mouth softened. He drew the bakery from the inside out. The window and the grey rain light and Rowena at the register with her hair escaping its clip, and when she saw it, something tightened in her chest. "You made me look like I belong here," she said. You do, Victor said, not looking up. Most people stand in their own spaces like guests. You don't. On the 5th day, he left something in his saucer when she wasn't looking. A small bird, carved from clay, no bigger than her thumb, with each feather scored by a tool she couldn't name. It was the most precise, delicate thing she had held in years. She turned it over in her hand and found that the body was hollow, and inside the hollow, small and cold and threaded on a piece of twine, was a key. Old brass, heavy, a single word scratched into the bow in letters so small she had to hold it up to the light. Hearthstone. She didn't understand it. She put it in her apron pocket and told herself she'd ask him tomorrow. The developer came that same afternoon. His name was Paxton Merrill, and he wore the kind of suit that announced itself before he'd fully come through the door. He set a folder on the counter and a business card on top and slid both toward her with the ease of a man who had made this gesture so many times it had become reflexive. He smiled, wide, immediate, the smile of someone who had been told smiling was effective and had learned to deploy it rather than feel it. Miss Hess. He looked around the Hearthstone the way you look at something you've already decided about. I represent Meridian Property Group. We've had our eye on this corner for a while. The building's on the historical register, which is a complication, but we have people for that. He tapped the folder. The bank has been sending you letters. I know because we have a relationship with your branch. The offer on the table is fair, and if you wait for the foreclosure, the number will be considerably smaller. Rowena looked at the card. She looked at the folder. She thought about the $58 in the register and the oven that had started making a sound like a complaint she couldn't diagnose. She picked up his folder and put it under the counter. Thank you for coming in, she said. Paxton Merrill smiled again, and this time there was something different in it, something that had run out of warmth and was working on reserve. Mrs. Hess, I've done this in 43 towns. The ones that wait never end up glad they did. I'll take my chances. Your aunt felt the same way. 3 years of feeling that way has a number attached to it. He looked at the register. You know the number. She came around the counter. Not quickly, not aggressively, but she came around it, and she was a woman who had carried 50-pound flour bags before sunrise for 3 years, and he was a man whose exercise was probably conceptual, and he registered this and went. The bell above the door gave its small, flat sound. Rowena stood in the middle of her bakery with her heart going hard, and the key warm in her apron pocket, and the sense that 2 things she didn't understand yet had arrived in the same week. Victor didn't come back the next day, or the day after. On the 3rd morning without him, a car came down Main Street that slowed when it reached the Hearthstone, and parked with the deliberate precision of someone who had checked the address twice. The woman who got out was in her 60s, silver-haired, wearing a coat that was both expensive and functional, carrying a slim leather case. She came to the counter and stood for a moment reading the room. Miss Hess. Her voice was precise and unhurried. My name is Mrs. Brandt. I'm an attorney. I represent the estate of Mr. Victor Aldgate. She paused a beat. I understand you knew him as Victor. Rowena put down the bread knife. Knew, past tense. The word landed differently than she'd expected, a cold drop directly to the center of the chest. Is he? She started. Very much alive, Mrs. Brandt said, and something at the corner of her mouth might have been amusement. Currently in Tucson, apparently attempting watercolors, which he tells me he has always been mediocre at and intends to continue. He is not a man who stays in one place long enough to be thanked. He acts and then he relocates. She set the leather case on the counter and opened it. I'm here because 4 days ago, Mr. Aldgate executed a transfer of title on a property he has held for 41 years. The transfer is complete. It has been recorded with the county. There is nothing to contest and nothing further to sign. As of this week, you are the sole owner of Aldgate House on Hemlock Road, the main residence, the workshop, the grounds, and the 7 acres the property occupies. It was last appraised at $1.2 million. The oven in the back made it sound. The rain from 3 days ago had left a streak on the front window that Rowena had been meaning to wipe. She heard herself make a sound that was not a word. He asked me to give you this, Mrs. Brandt said, and placed on the counter an envelope, cream-colored, her name on the front in handwriting she recognized from the back of her order pad. He was specific. You read it after I've told you the number, so you know you're not dreaming. The attorney looked at her steadily. Before you open it, Miss Hess, there is something I'm required to tell you. Mr. Aldgate has a son, Dorian. He runs what remains of the Aldgate family holdings. He did not know about this transfer until this morning. He is, by every measure I've taken of him over the years, a methodical man. He will arrive here by this afternoon." She clicked the case shut. "He will make you an offer. He may make it kindly, he may not. Either way, before you say anything to him, read the letter." The bell above the door gave its sound, and Mrs. Brandt was gone, and the envelope sat on the counter in handwriting Rowena knew, and the key in her apron pocket felt suddenly enormous. She thought about opening the letter. Instead, she thought about the key, and the words scratched into it, and she put the letter in her pocket beside the key, locked the front door, and stood in the middle of the hearthstone, trying to understand how a cup of coffee had led here. Dorian Aldgate came at 3. He was not what she had assembled in her mind. She'd built him from Mrs. Brandt's careful accounting, methodical, formidable, and expected something rigid. What walked in was tall, mid-30s, in clothes that had been expensive that morning, and had stopped caring about it since. He stood inside the door and looked at the bakery the way his father had looked at it, like a man reading a room, not dismissing it. His eyes were his father's eyes, pale grey, quick and unsettling in a face this young. "Mrs. Hess," he said, not a question. "The son," she said. He came to the counter and did not sit. He placed his hands flat on the surface and looked at her directly. "I'll be straightforward. My father is not well. He's brilliant and he's generous, and he has been making large, irreversible decisions based on feelings since before I was born. A court will look at a man his age transferring $1 million property to a woman he met last week and see exactly what that looks like on paper." "What does it look like?" "Exploitation," he said. "Not by you, I'm not saying that. But to a judge who has seen this pattern, it reads that way. I'm offering you a way out that doesn't end in 3 years of litigation eating whatever number you're imagining." He drew a checkbook from his jacket. 300,000. "I'll have our people speak to your bank, clear whatever the balance is. You keep the bakery. You never go up that road." Rowena looked at the checkbook. She looked at the key, which she'd taken out of her pocket without deciding to. She looked at Dorian Aldgate's father's eyes looking back at her from a stranger's face. "When did you last see him?" she asked. His jaw tightened. "Mrs. Hess." "Your father, when did you last see him?" "That's not relevant." "He came in here 4 times, she said. He ate slowly. Not because he wasn't hungry. He was, I could tell. But because going slow was the last thing he had that was entirely his. He drew me." She set the order pad on the counter between them, turned to the sketch. "He told me the hands had gone before the work did. That knowing you stopped for the wrong reasons is worse than losing the hands." She watched the drawing land on him, watched something move behind the careful face. "He left me a key with a single word scratched into it. I don't know what it opens yet. But I'm going up to find out, and I think you should come with me when I do." Dorian was quiet. The November light went flat in the window. "He told me the workshop was off limits my whole life," he said finally. His voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but denser, like something solid under the surface. Said it was where he kept the work that hadn't earned the right to be seen. "I was 37 years old before I understood that some locked doors are locked toward you, not against you." He paused. "He sent me to you, didn't he?" "I think so." He put the checkbook away. "Show me the letter at the house," he said. She should have listened. She knew that afterward. But Rowena Hess had spent 3 years being told by careful men what she couldn't afford to do, and the habit of doing it anyway was the one part of her aunt's inheritance that had ever fit her exactly right. So when the November light went long and flat, and she had run out of things to pretend to organize, she flipped the sign to closed an hour early, and got into Lila's old truck with the brass key on the seat beside her, and drove north on Hemlock Road alone. The property appeared between the bare trees the way something appears in a dream, gradually, and then all at once. A pale stone house with a long porch and dark windows and a copper beach at the edge of the gravel drive, so large it had become its own weather system, enormous and skeletal against the November sky. Behind the house, low and long, a workshop with north-facing windows, dark against the grey except for a single lamp burning in the corner. Rowena stopped the truck. She sat with the engine ticking as it cooled. Someone had turned on that light. She had told no one she was coming, and yet. She got out of the truck and walked toward it. The workshop door was unlocked. It opened with the groan of wood that has settled into itself over decades, and the smell reached her before the room did, clay dust and linseed and the mineral cold of fired stone, and beneath that something older. Cedar and the particular sweetness of things kept carefully for a very long time. A woman stood at the far end, small and square, in a wool coat the color of a winter field, white hair cut close, black eyes that had been watching the door since before Rowena had reached it. Figured you'd come alone, the woman said. Vic said you would. Said his son would drive up with a checkbook and a plan, and you'd come up the hill by yourself with the key. Her mouth did something dry at the corner. He knows his people. Always was better at understanding strangers than the ones right in front of him. Who are you? Rowena said. Greta Hearn. I've kept this house since before you were born. She said it the way you give your age, a plain fact, carrying what it carried. He called me from the bus station. Wouldn't buy a proper phone call but gave away a house, which tells you what you need to know about how his mind works. She looked at Rowena steadily. The boy's coming. I can hear a car on the grade, so you'd best come look at what you came to see before he fills the room with questions. The lamp was on a long work table, and Greta reached up and swung the arm of it toward the far wall, and the light moved, and the wall came alive with it. Not a wall, a gallery. Ceramic pieces, floor to the high rafters, hung or mounted or set on narrow shelves, every size from palm small to the breadth of a window, and every one of them the face of the same woman. A young woman with a wide, crooked smile and strong hands and dark hair she seemed always to be pushing out of her face. The clay had her in every light, laughing still, mid-thought, asleep. A woman at a counter, a woman in a garden, a woman standing in an open doorway in winter with snow behind her and her face tipped up as though checking for more. Rowena's legs stopped working. She knew that doorway. She knew that posture, the particular way the body tipped, left hip out, chin angled up. She had seen it 1,000 times at the back door of the Hearthstone, on a woman who had told her the cold never really bothered her, who had bought the bakery when nobody thought it was worth buying, who had given it to Rowena when she had nothing else left to give. That's Aunt Lila, Rowena said. Her voice came out wrong. Lila Hess. Greta's voice had gone very quiet. She was Lila Corwin when he met her. Waitressing at a place in town that's been a parking lot for 20 years. He came up to do a commission for a summer family on the lake. He was 24, she was 22. She stopped. They had a year. The kind of year people write songs about, except they were both too private for songs. The workshop door opened behind them. Dorian Aldgate stood in it, breathing hard, his pale hair disordered from the cold outside, his collar dark at the fold. He had come around the long way and at a run. He looked at his father's life's work on every wall, and his face went through 4 different countries in the span of 2 seconds. Who is she? He said. Not a question so much as the place before a question, the moment of realizing there is one. He came into the room. The way you approach something you're afraid will turn out to be real. He stopped in front of the largest piece, Lila in the doorway, snow behind her, face tipped to the sky, and stood with his grandfather's checkbook in his jacket, and everything he'd driven 2 hours certain of going quietly to pieces. There are dozens of her, he said. 39, Greta said. He never counted. I did. Dorian's jaw moved. He had photographs, ordinary ones in albums of the house and the commission work, not of a person. Never like. He broke off and turned, and his face was open in a way that faces are usually not open in front of strangers. The expression of a man who has just learned that the silence he grew up inside had been full of sound he simply couldn't hear. Why didn't he say her name? Not once. Not ever. Greta answered without softening it, because softening it now would have been its own kind of dishonesty. Because the family wouldn't allow it. His mother found out he meant to marry a girl who waited tables, and she did what those people do. She didn't shout, she bought. Lila's father had a small construction business and a loan against it at a bank where the Aldgates held a seat on the board. One telephone call and the note came due early, and the business went, and the family scattered up the valley looking for work. Victor was made to understand that the same thing would happen again, and worse if he didn't give her up. So he did. To savor the second ruin, he was allowed to keep making his work. They couldn't take the clay. And so he put her here, in the one room no Aldgate had the authority to enter, and he kept her the only way they permitted him to keep anything. Dorian sat down on the work table as though the structure holding him upright had been quietly removed. He sat with his hands loose on his knees and looked at 39 faces of a woman whose name he had never once heard inside that house. My grandmother, he said very quietly, sat at the end of a 20-foot table for 30 years and never once looked like she wanted to be there. I thought that was simply how she was. I thought they were both just cold. He laughed, a small, terrible sound. I grew up thinking cold was the natural condition of people. You came up here with a checkbook, Rowena said. It was not an accusation. She said it the way you say a true thing to someone who is already in the process of understanding it. I came up here with everything I had, he said. He looked at her. The grey eyes were his father's, younger and rawer, and uncertain in a way Victor's never had been. I didn't know this was here. My whole life I managed what he left me to manage, and never asked because the asking felt like prying. He dragged a hand over his face. He gave you a house he told me was the one thing that would never leave the family. I memorized that. I built plans around it. There's something else, Greta said. She reached under the work table, into the deep shadow the lamp didn't reach, and brought out a cedar chest, long and flat, fitted with brass clasps gone green with age, and a new padlock through the hasp, bright and recent and twin to nothing else in the room. Rowena took the key from her pocket. She looked at Dorian. She looked at the 39 faces of her Aunt Lila watching from the wall. She unlocked the chest. The lid rose an inch on its own, releasing a smell of old paper and cedar and a dried sweetness she couldn't name. And then Rowena opened it the rest of the way and looked inside. On top was a piece of clay no bigger than her palm, fired and finished. The back doorway of the Hearthstone, exact in every detail, with a small figure in it, face tipped up, waiting for snow. She recognized it. She had stood in that doorway 1,000 times and thought her aunt was watching the road. She set it aside. Beneath it the chest was full of documents. Dorian took the top folder with careful hands and opened it and read, and she watched his face change the way she'd watched a sky change over water. One thing, and then without any visible line between, wholly another. This is a conservation land trust, he said. Recorded. There's the county stamp. 6 weeks ago. He turned a page. The whole property, the house, the workshop, all 7 acres. Placed in perpetual trust with the Valley Conservancy. No development, no subdivision, no sale for commercial purposes. He looked up slowly. Ever, in perpetuity, he was very still. Paxton Merrill came to him first, didn't he? Merrill came to me, Rowena said. Meridian Property Group. He's been working the Hemlock Road corridor for 2 years. This parcel was the last piece he needed for the full headland. Dorian set the folder down with the controlled precision of a man keeping his hands from shaking. He came to me in the spring, made an offer. I was considering it. The holdings are in bad shape. I've been holding them together since my father stopped being interested in the practical side. He looked at the recorded documents. Dad knew. He knew I was considering it. So he tied the land before I could sell it, and then he gave the house to someone who wouldn't. He said it without blame, which was the thing that made it land hardest. Under the trust documents were older papers, brittle, bound in faded green ribbon. Dorian opened them and went still. Bank records, he said. From 1987, the loan acceleration. Board minutes, he read, turned a page, read again. My grandmother's name is on a memo here, her handwriting. He set the pages down. His voice had gone very quiet. She wrote to the bank president directly. She destroyed a man's business to separate him from a girl who carried plates. He looked up, and I grew up thinking she was simply cold. She wasn't cold. She was calculating. There is a considerable difference. Rowena was crying. She was doing it standing up and without any particular drama, the way her aunt had probably done it 100 times at that same back doorway, with nobody watching. She was crying for a woman who had believed to her last quiet evening that she had been the reckless one, that she had ruined her own father with her wanting, that the love had been the mistake. She was crying because it had not been, because the proof of it was right here in another person's handwriting, in a chest that had been locked for 37 years, so that someday someone would know whose fault it wasn't. Dorian stood near enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he let her, and after a while she said, "The workshop." "What about it?" 39 pieces. 40 years of his best work in the best light on the property, and no one has ever seen them. She looked at him steadily. "You said the gallery hasn't made a profit since before you took it over, that you've been running it at a loss." He blinked. The thought arrived in him visibly. His work has never been properly shown. He always refused, signed the pieces but wouldn't sell or exhibit. I never understood why, and he wouldn't explain. His eyes moved to the wall. Something was rising in him, she could see it, slow and enormous. The opposite of the grief that had been there a minute before. A retrospective, his life's work. 39 ceramic portraits of a woman nobody knew he loved, with the true story told on the gallery wall. What the family did, what it cost, why he kept her here for 37 years in a room they weren't allowed to enter. He looked at her. "Do you know what that's worth?" "Not the house, not the land. These." "Tell it true," Rowena said. "All of it, what the family did, what it cost, why he kept her." She went to her grave thinking she'd been the foolish one. She looked at the documents on the table. She was never the foolish one. She was only the one they weren't afraid to punish. Dorian was quiet for a long time. "I can't do this alone," he said finally. I can do the business of it, the financing, the logistics. But I don't know how to make people feel something. I've spent my whole life keeping the practical side running. I never learned the part that matters past the numbers. I know how to make people feel something, Rowena said. I've been feeding strangers for 3 years. It turns out to be the same work. She looked at him, at the grey eyes that were his father's, in a face that was learning it didn't have to be so careful. Sit down. I have bread in the truck. You drove 3 hours and tried to buy me out and learned your entire family history in the dark. Eat something first. Something crossed his face that was not yet a smile, but was. She thought the place a smile comes from when a person has not used it in a long time and isn't sure it still works. You're going to feed me, he said, like you fed him. I'm going to feed you, she said, because you're hungry, and because it's the one reckless, generous thing nobody has ever managed to talk me out of. Paxton Merrill withdrew from the Hemlock Road corridor by January. There was nothing left there worth pursuing. The Conservation Trust had seen to that, and when Dorian's attorney sent Meridian Property Group a courtesy copy of the easement documents along with a politely worded note about the 1987 bank memo and the Aldgate family's long-standing relationship with the county recorder's office, Meridian found other corridors to pursue. The retrospective opened in March. They called it the Corwin Pieces. Her name, Lila's name, restored to the work it had always been the subject of, printed on the gallery wall in letters as large as the building could bear. People came from 2 states away. They stood in front of 39 clay faces of a laughing woman and wept without embarrassment, and they read the wall text that told the true story plainly. The girl and the artist, the loan called early, the 37 years of silence, the locked room and the locked chest, kept so that someday someone would know it was not her fault. The gallery turned a profit for the first time in over a decade. The proceeds were structured into a foundation that could not be touched by any board or any bank or any helpful person Meridian had kept like art around the county. Dorian called Rowena from the opening night and said, very quietly, that he did not know how to say thank you for something this large, and she said that was all right. She'd never needed the thank you, only for it to be true. Victor wrote from New Mexico. He wrote on the backs of postcards, the handwriting cramped and legible, complaining about the altitude and a watercolor class he was auditing at a community college, which he described as both humbling and instructive. He did not thank her, and she understood that thanking her would have meant he thought he'd done her a favor. He had not. He had done himself one. In one postcard, below his complaints about the dry air, he wrote a single line. You gave a stubborn old man coffee when he said not to, and it turned out the coffee was the whole of it. Keep feeding the ones who tell you they can't pay. That's the one that always matters. She kept the postcard above the register, beside the small clay doorway piece she'd set in a narrow frame. Lila in her back doorway, face tipped up, waiting for something just outside the frame to arrive. Dorian came in on a Thursday in April, the first genuinely warm day, the one that promises the rest of the season. He sat at the counter and she put coffee in front of him without asking, the way she did for people who had become regulars. And the word surprised her. Regular. The way the right word surprises you when you find it in a place you have been looking for a long time without knowing that's what you were doing. The Conservancy Board wants to know if the workshop could open for artist residencies, he said, long term. The North Light is apparently exceptional. I've been told this by 4 different people who've seen it now. What did you tell them? That I'd ask you. He wrapped both hands around his mug, his father's gesture, though she doubted he knew it. It's your property. It's his legacy, she said. Feels right that other people make things there. He nodded. He looked at his coffee. He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who has been rehearsing something and has just run out of reasons not to say it. I've been thinking about what you said in March, he said, that you wouldn't need the thank you, only for it to be true. I remember. I'm not good at the part where you say the true thing to someone who matters. He looked up, and the grey eyes were direct and a little frightened, and entirely without the armor he'd walked into the Hearthstone wearing, back when he was still a man with a checkbook and a plan. I'm working on it. I wanted you to know I'm working on it. Rowena leaned her elbows on the counter. You drove out here on a Thursday to tell me that. I brought the Conservancy paperwork. He set a folder down. That's the official reason. And the actual reason? He looked at her. He took a breath. I wanted to see if the coffee was still good. It was. She poured him another cup, and the April light came through the old brick window, the same way it always had. warm and partial, and making everything in the room look like something worth staying in. And the small clay doorway sat in its frame above the register, and if you looked at it long enough in the right light, you could see the shape of a woman who had believed for 37 years that she was the foolish one. She hadn't been. That was the thing Rowena kept returning to, the thing that sat in her chest like a coal, warm and permanent and unasked for. Lila Hess had lived her whole life believing the love had cost her something. It hadn't. The love was the only part of it that had stayed whole. The love was in 39 pieces of fired clay in a cedar smelling room, and it had outlasted every careful, practical person who had ever tried to make it smaller. It had outlasted all of them. It was still here. Rowena kept the hearthstone open. She kept the door unlocked past closing when the weather turned hard, and she kept a pot on for whoever came in with that particular look. The eyes that went to the counter first and then quickly away, ashamed of the wanting. She set coffee down before they'd finished deciding not to ask, and she told them it was going to go cold anyway, and she meant it as the kindest possible lie, which she had learned from the best woman she knew, and intended to keep telling to strangers on Carver's Mill Road until she couldn't lift a pot. Because it turned out the old man, with the clay under his nails, had been right about the one thing that mattered. It was always the coffee. It was always the soup. It was always the plate set down in front of someone who said they couldn't pay, in a room that smelled of flour and mourning, and whatever small stubborn hope a person builds their life around when all the sensible options have already been taken. It was always the one reckless, generous thing. And it was, as it turned out, the only thing that ever lasted.